at the mic.
Hey everyone, welcome to Your Bytes, Your Rights, a weekly interdisciplinary discussion and podcast about data ownership, digital rights, and your privacy. In episode 36, we talk about your password and why they suck. I'm Jeff Jokish, founder of Privacy Plan and a vocal data privacy researcher. I live at the intersection of privacy and data about privacy. And I'm here with my co-host, Chris Kmeyer, managing partner at ssW0rd Capital. Chris runs a venture firm focused on blockchain solutions. And as a former software developer and lawyer, he's been working on data rights, the future of money, and recreating reality consensus. How can we do that, Chris? How can we create reality consensus?
Well, ultimately, it's all about information distribution. We have to stop lying, basically. We have to stop lying about currencies, about money, and we have to not allow to inject third parties into our communication and let them polarize the narrative. Ultimately, that's what's happening at scale. And as far as I'm concerned, that's why you're seeing the externalities in the world that we're seeing today. Because if you create platforms that have their own interests, i.e. increasing the optimization of shareholder value, then obviously you and I and everybody else who wants to exchange information on what we call the World Wide Web today, which I call the digital landfill, then at that point in time, these interests will override your own and have then led to the polarization of a lot of different discussions. But then ultimately, I think we can actually pretty easily fix that for the benefit of everybody once we're realizing what's actually going on. And we're getting closer to that, but it's something that you and I have been discussing for some time and that we here internally started writing about 14 years ago. So a lot of people have to catch up to that, including lawmakers. Anyway, let us introduce our guest today who knows more than we do about password managers, a topic that I keep struggling with. I keep installing them and then not using them. So important topic that we need to shine a light on. So Don, tell us what you are doing.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. I'm DW, technical evangelist at YBYR. So I work with some of our
Recording in
enterprise clients.
progress.
I work with
Yeah, and by the way, as I already indicated, when something goes wrong, it's always my fault. So the Zoom line is now open too, even though we started streaming whatever we were streaming before that. So keep going, Don.
That's okay. Yeah, thank you. And yeah, so I work with our community. I work with our sales team, and also just educating people about the importance of protecting those passwords. So we're just happy for anyone to get those passwords out of those Excel sheets. So any day that we can get a couple more passwords out of there and into a password manager, we are happy. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, a lot of people probably still have their sticky notes on their laptop or under their desk or on their monitors stuck to some place, or some Google sheet with all of them.
Yeah, some community members sharing online different password books being sold at different stores. So it's kind of funny seeing those kind of old archaic books, but they can have their time and place as a backup. But yeah, with an open source solution, we're trying to move people in the other direction.
Yeah, so how many users do you have at Bitwarden today?
Yeah, so at Bitwarden, we work with tens of thousands of companies, and also it's millions of customers right now. So it's quite a big populace, and it's kind of divided into a couple different camps. We always have our free offerings, so that's where we began. And anyone can store any amount of passwords in Bitwarden for free. And then we have our enterprise offerings. So it's kind of we split our time between the different populace that we serve.
That's nice. I've got some statistics, guys. I'm looking at one here. 57% of respondents admit to writing down work-related online passwords on sticky notes.
And 57?
57, right? And 67% of those admit to having lost those sticky notes. So
and are no longer able to log into things as a result.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's hard to remember your personal passwords, let alone all those work passwords, right?
That's right, and it's the best when someone walks by and they can see that password, or you take a shot of your workplace and you're broadcasting that password to everyone.
Well, I think password hygiene is really worse than people think. So everybody thinks that maybe they're a little better than the next guy, but it's pretty bad. I mean, 65% of people always or mostly use the same password or a variation of those passwords across all their accounts, which is just egregious because we know that's how a lot of hackers get your password. It's not that they crack the password for your bank, right? It's that they hack the password for Facebook, right? Or some library card that you use, right? Or something that has very low security, and then they find out that that's the same password you use for your crypto account or your bank, right? Or your medical records, and that's how they get the important information.
Yeah, so on that note, Dan, when you install that enterprise offering, is there a check for that the software does? As in, will you go out and see if these passwords that people are storing are being reused or if the particular accounts are already compromised?
That's a huge part of it. And even with the free account, you can get a password breach report, which syncs with Have I Been Pwned. So it empowers users to see where their information is ending up on the web. But with the enterprise offering, there's about 5 or 6 different reports that'll show you any weak passwords reused, exposed, any URLs you're storing with the item that don't have a secure HTTPS. So a lot of different ways that kind of make the team realize, hey, we're not as secure as we thought. So it's kind of nice to shine a light on all those aspects of credential management.
And then the obvious first question is always, so now I create one password for my password manager. So what do you think is kind of best practice how to go about that particular one there?
That's a fantastic question. And I think that's most people's hesitation about moving to a password manager. And something about Bitwarden that I love, and I was a fan before I even worked here, is just the open source nature. I always tell people, don't trust us. Check with the community, check with our third-party audits. There's a lot of conversation and code out there. And someone even came up to me and they said, with all these code base leaks going on, what's Bitwarden doing to protect the code base? And I said, well, it's already on GitHub. You can have a look at it. But yeah, basically, sorry, I think I went on a tangent. What was your question?
No, what do you do with the one password? What's your best recommendation with the one password that you're creating to access password manager, right?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So the typical experience for most people is going to be reusing the same password, having a couple versions of the same password, or just hitting that forgot my password button a lot of the time.
I do that every single time. It's like for 90% of my accounts, I don't even bother. I punch something in, and the next time I go there, I just reset it, right?
Exactly. So it kind of creates this service where a lot of those, can be brute force quite easily if they're simple derivatives of something or not super complex passwords, because we can only hold so much in our mind, especially if we're not using a passphrase that's meeting certain entropy. So basically the best practice, if we're having someone sign up on our website, for example, we have a password generator, which you don't even have to be logged in to use. So you automatically can have that password created based on a certain amount of special characters, length, and that's so to speak. And then you want to enable your 2FA. So just having a password isn't going to protect you. Having that two-factor is really what's going to stop someone from getting into your account if your credentials are breached somewhere on the internet, which is quite common. And there's a whole bunch of different ways to protect your master password. Some people will store that in a vault at their home, or if it's a passphrase, they'll memorize it. So there's a couple different options, but yeah, that is the starting piece to protect your solution, especially with something that is end-to-end encrypted with zero knowledge. We can never recover the master password because even our team can't see what it is.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably
unless you have sorry, I should amend that with we do have a password reset for administrators on enterprise.
Well, this is probably a very geeky question, but we just had the discussion internally because we have our own Skunkworks division doing our own like DeFi related development, so we know the technology so that we are investing in essentially. But so the question came on, well, end-to-end encryption is something that as a buzzword is being thrown around a lot. But if there's a company in the middle that needs to maintain those servers, is that still considered end-to-end encryption, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And basically, the encrypted blob does exist on a server. but with Bitwarden, everything happens on the client end so that the master password never gets transmitted to these servers. So we're going to mix your master password with some salting and hashing with your email, and there's going to be a version of that synced to the server, but it can never be reverse engineered. And even if someone got a hold of that blob, because they can't get the master password, they can't reverse engineer that information.
Yeah, and you mentioned the term earlier that I personally really like, entropy, but in the context of passwords specifically, do you want to explain this a little more for people who are listening who might not be familiar with the term in the context of passwords?
Yeah, in a simple sense, entropy can refer to the ability for someone to easily access through a brute force hack or social engineering or doing some research on your social media accounts to find information about you. And having entropy with your passwords means that you're taking care to use an appropriate length, use special characters, or if you're using passphrases, to pick a certain number of words. And what that does is it increases exponentially the amount of time that it takes a hacker or bad actor to gain access to your account. So at Bitwarden, we recommend at least 16 characters with mixed special characters, just to make sure that we're not, the old 8-character password limits is gone.
Right. Oh, I wanted to add something there. A lot of people don't know what entropy actually means. Maybe chaos is something a little more in the common lexicon, but I'm a big proponent of length being very important. So I'm glad to hear you say 16 characters is sort of the minimum that you recommend. But I also think that if you're picking words, those words matter. And some of the statistics when I was looking through the words people use in their passwords are just like amazingly stupid. Like using your first name or your child's name in your password. You can't do that, folks, right? And for business passwords, you can't put the name of the business in the password, right? Those are just like throwing away those characters out of the entropy or the chaos, because the people that are trying to crack those passwords are going to use those characters first, right? And when they're trying to brute force crack your password. So it's like those characters don't even exist in your password. Just throw those away.
That's a great point. And one thing I always speak to is, say somebody needs to store like 3 security questions to get access to their account. We're always like, okay, where do we store these 3 questions now? Now that I use a password manager, I store those with completely chaotic and randomized content, because if you start using security questions that's based on information that somebody might be able to get from your Facebook account, you're pretty much giving them a key to your backdoor. So making sure to add that chaos and that randomization really does help secure your accounts.
Yeah, that's great.
So does your particular application work with any of the biometric solutions out of the gate out there? And if so, are there some that you recommend, like the fingerprint ones? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. Any device that has biometrics enabled should be supported by Bitwarden. Linux we're still working on, but PC, Mac, mobile device, to reduce the number of times that you have to enter your master password, you can leave your vault in a locked state. And if it's locked instead of logged out, you can just use your fingerprint or your Face ID. I personally use the Touch ID because that's what I have on my device. And then we have that available for the browser extension too, which works with our desktop application. I always recommend people take great care with securing your personal device. And that's what gives me the comfort to use some of these secure biometric tools, like the biometrics on Apple is stored in the secure enclave. So even if someone did somehow try to get it, they're not going to get your actual fingerprint.
And what do you think of those actual authenticator apps? Now there's like a dozen or so out there. Now I'm consistently confused about those because they're all almost called identical. The one from Microsoft, the one from Google, and there's a bunch of other ones out there. And I always have to toggle through them. It's like, which one did I use for this particular site? Right?
That's a fantastic question. And I typically will go for a solution, and there's 2 answers to this. One is that some people choose to store their TOTP in Bitwarden, depending on their threat model and where they need access to it. An example of that is if I used to work in an office, and you'd have to like email the code to somebody because you both shared that account. So in cases where it's shared, you can do that if the threat surface is acceptable. The other answer is that I like to support authenticator apps that allow you to back up your seeds. So you might see someone in our community that's like, oh my goodness, I've lost my phone. I can't get access to these things now. So it's extremely important not only to, store your recovery code for any of these accounts, but also to make sure that your tool, whether it's something like Ravo or Aegis, it has a backup function so that you are thinking about backups. As soon as you go the password manager route, you want to make sure that you're taking care to have the access back to those items should you change your device or lose access to it.
I started to switch over to Authy because it can sort of transfer between devices, I think,
Yeah.
right? But I think some of the other authentication managers are starting to do that now. So it's maybe a little bit less of a need. But I think you're right. I mean, it's really terrible to put all of your authentication codes into one app and then lose the phone that has that app on it. That's just untenable, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So my
Yeah,
daily pain is specifically with Google and their universal login. Google wants you to log into your browser, and then by extension you log into your Gmail and the other Google services that are reachable through the browser. But because I have, I don't know, probably almost a dozen at this point in time that I accumulated for different projects over the years that we engaged with, I consistently have issues with that, right? Because I will look for a document, but I'm logged into one particular instance that just doesn't have access to that particular document. I think Jeff and I just went through the exercise on Tuesday. He's like, well, I know I recorded this, but the document is not here seemingly, right? Do you have a good answer for that? Like how to either circumvent or overlay the universal login that Google provides? Because specifically, and people know this if they listened to the show in the past, I don't trust Google one bit, right? Even I also don't trust Apple, but I probably trust Google less, and they're specifically the holding company Alphabet, more specifically, with my personal identifiable data or anything that should be private. Because again, by nature, this is a for-profit company that is not a search engine, but that's selling social engineering as a service to the highest bidder. So for them, it's in their best interest to have all your personal identifiable data and everything that makes up you as an individual and at your agency at their disposal at any point in time. It's utterly against their own self-interest to circumvent them from being able to de-anonymize you. But that's exactly what you must do, actually, right? Every time you interact with digital technologies.
Yeah, that's a great point, and something that I also choose Apple over Google, and I'm not saying Apple's perfect by any means. I don't, you can't trust any company without being open source. You can't exactly know what's always happening. And so what I do with my Apple device is I keep everything split across a variety of sources that I trust, such as Proton, such as Firefox, Signal, Simple Login, so that if any one source is ever breached, they only have a certain access to the spectrum of my whole identity digitally. It just provides a little bit of protection instead of just using an Apple or Google device and then just giving everything to this one company. And bringing that back to how we started is that part of the whole vision was to make it an open ecosystem and cross-platform so that you don't have those limitations of platforms. So passwords can be brought in from anywhere. They can be exported. You decide not to use YBYR and you can just take it out and go on your way. There's some services like Samsung has some kind of password manager, and you can't even take it out. So something that was really important to us as a team is just to make sure that it's available on all the desktops, all the browsers, all the mobile devices. We even have an F-Droid repo for anyone who wants to remove some of that tracking that we use just for crash reporting. So there's just a lot of different options, and we try and eliminate the platform from even being an issue.
Yeah,
I think that sort of fragmentation is valuable, and people should take heed of that advice. I'm a Bitwarden user, but I'm always a little bit skeptical of putting all of my eggs in one basket. So one of the things that I do is even though I put like 95% of all my passwords into Bitwarden for my like primary bank account and a couple of other accounts, I don't put those in that. And in fact, I actually use a whole separate computer for my banking and a couple of other things. And I never do anything else on that computer except for those couple of, things, right? So that that particular computer never has access to social media or other types of web browsing that might potentially infect it, right? And has no connection to my other passwords or, there's no cross contamination, hopefully. And that's the concept behind that. It's the pain in the ass really, because, you have, a whole separate, system essentially for finance, but hopefully it's safer.
Yeah, and I think that's great. And we support anyone using any tool that helps keep you safe online and any configuration of that. And one example is if someone doesn't even want to put all of their items in a vault, they can do peppering. So you could have a couple different characters that you add to your password. So say you autofill it, it doesn't give someone access to the account unless you add your specific couple characters on the end there. So there's a couple different ways to be flexible too with adding that information.
So personally, what browser do you use, or what browsers? What's kind of your default browser that you go to?
So my favorite is Firefox, and part of that is I love the open source community, and I'll be on Element in a Matrix chat room chatting with some of the developers, and I like being close to the source so that you can talk to people about how things are working, you can report bugs, there's like an open conversation. So that instills a trust from my end, and that's sort of how I pick the tools that I use.
And so we have a very specific language in our field that we're kind of trying to propagate to get away from the more, what I would consider inaccurate kind of metaphors that people are using. The usual one would be like my digital identity, which to me, identity is a whole different discipline that doesn't have anything to do with what we are talking about right now. To me, identity requires consciousness. It's kind of the whole human being, the individual that you are. And the point why this is important for me is because you must make the distinction of who has agency in the digital space, as in, is this still self-determination? Is this something that you can direct and inform? So, but the point of that preface here is, I think the layer that we are kind of sorely missing is that of the self-determined persona. And the way I define a persona is it's the data online that you control within a certain, let's call it, platform for our discussion for a minute, right? So on LinkedIn, it would be the fields that you have access to and that you can update. So I want to update my first name, last name, and sometimes there's also, as you know, certain limitations to that. It will tell you, oh, you can only do this once. If you once decided you want to be Christian, then you can't be John afterwards. You get that chance once, so you have to establish a new account. But larger point there, though, is that what people are usually referring to in this context is a profile, which is something else. As far as Jeff and I are concerned, profile is what a platform has about you. It's all the fields that they have in their database that they assign to this particular individual in meet space in order to target them. That's why it's called a profile. We're going to target you. So point there being is, in this preface, is there a way specifically with Bitwarden, and or do you know of any other, to delineate this personas and then propagate this in a very defined way across these different platforms?
So in a way that you're not using the same email for all your accounts, you mean, or?
In all of the ways, as in, when I'm on LinkedIn, then I want to have access to all the fields, but also I want to make sure that this is entirely segregated piece of information for a number of reasons. I want to know when LinkedIn is compromised, right? So I want to know, and initially, and I used to be somewhat religious about this since like the early 90s. I've been running my own email server, so I initially started to set up a new email for every account that I created. So it would be LinkedIn at kmeyer.com. It would be Facebook, when I was still on Facebook a decade ago, at kmeyer.com, and so forth. So if I got spam from there, right? So in my catch-all account, I knew who was compromised, right? But I wish something would exist today that kind of automate that, right? Where it specifically says, this is the identifier that I control. I'm the only one that knows that this is an identifier where the, let's call it counterparty, the platform gets to attach personal identifiable data to that they collect. And then I also know when it's being abused, because that's a single identifier that basically points me to their database, not the other way around, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're speaking. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we all know about, the guys that like have multiple Twitter accounts and they accidentally sign in as the wrong one and, type out some dumb message and then get, caught out because they thought they were as one account and they were actually on the other. But it sort of points to the fact that we have different facets of our lives. So, different types of identities that we like to be. Sometimes, we have malevolent purposes for that, but often it's just because they're different aspects of our personality.
Yeah,
right?
or think about like obvious things, and that has happened multiple times in the history of our company. So we'll have a person at the company who's in charge of the company account on these platforms, and then that person moves on to another company, and there might not be perfect policies in place, and all of a sudden you lose access to that particular account, and maybe that person is no longer accessible for whatever reason, but now you're stuck, right? So, and I had that happen where LinkedIn tried to kick me off their platform because I was logging in with one of our employees' account. We no longer have to update an entry from our own company, right? But there is no, right now in the current configuration, there wasn't or still is no, as far as I can tell, way to mitigate that, where you basically create a company account and then you can authorize yourself against that account as being a current employee and or director or manager at that entity. I think a lot of these systems simply didn't think this through, right? So they are more concerned with just user growth and engagement and other KPIs rather than long-term usability for the people that are actually the ones that are creating the value on the platform.
Right. Well, think about this, guys. So you're logged into your operating system as a particular identity, right? And then you're logged into your email system as a particular identity. And then you're logged into your platform as a particular identity. And another platform as a particular identity, right? And all of these identity systems, right, are trying to cross-correlate who's connected to what, right? But we should be controlling, right? And saying, okay, I'm logged in as Jeff A, or I'm logged in as Jeff B, or I'm logged in as the CEO, right? And it should all be under our control rather than us having to log in separately with different shards of our identity across these multiple different layers and silos. That's what's confusing and a pain in the ass, and why we have so many problems with identity.
Yeah, so maybe can you give us some insights on your guys' roadmap, and specifically as it pertains to the stuff we were just talking about in terms of being...
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation, and LinkedIn in particular, because they've had so many breaches in the past. So I have a very sterile work account, but I don't have an extensive personal account because there's just too much data at stake. Especially when you're going into your work history, your education history, everyone that you're connected with. That's a lot of information to be exposed to someone. So LinkedIn is a very interesting one. But to your point earlier about all the different masking, I love all that stuff. Different phone numbers, different emails for accounts, different addresses. I have part of my background is digital media marketing, so you learn very quickly about the collection of this information and how the exposure of that can be used to create a social engineering attack, even to your friend, family, colleague, and CEO. So yeah, as much as we're looking at a better system to move towards that one identity, And one space where identity and authentication is changing is with passkeys. So part of that conversation is Google and Apple offering the ability of your device now to authenticate you. So instead of all these different identities, you have your phone that's vouching for you to access the device, which is now phishing resistant because it only works with that one website. So because there will always be community that doesn't want to be locked into an ecosystem, BitWarden is also looking into passkey support. So as much as identity and authentication is changing and moving forward, our team is also making sure that we're in place to support anyone who believes in that open ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, whenever you have a corporation, that's obviously what worries me. A corporation is domiciled under a certain jurisdiction and oftentimes will just respond to whatever regulator, law enforcement, otherwise want to extort out of them without necessarily making their customers, which are often not their customers, but the product that they're selling, a priority, right? So oftentimes you won't know that there is, let's say, an inquiry into your personal information, which if that entity that represents the government had to do this without the help of that intermediary, would have sent you directly a subpoena and alert you of that fact. And that's just an example from the civil societies. If you then multiply this by the dangers introduced by authoritarian governments who just make these weapons essentially against their own citizens, that's just much worse. But so the larger point, the being Bitwarden is organized as a corporation domiciled in the United States at the moment, or is there another arm to that people can feel comfortable with?
Yeah, we're headquartered in the States, so in Santa Barbara, but we meet international compliance because everything is locally decrypted on your device before being transmitted to our data servers. So even if there was a request for information, nothing can be returned from the encrypted log because we don't even have access to decrypt it. So typically, once we let our community or clients know about that, it assures them with using the service.
And are you guys storing anything like IP addresses or any other identifiable data?
Yeah, we have a section on our website, administrative data, which we're very transparent. It shows exactly what we need to allow your account to function. So it's going to list that information. But people are also free to use whatever email they want to sign up. They can use a masked email, for example. And as one example, talking about corporations kind of monetizing things and having to release information, some password managers might track all of your URLs. And if somebody had all of your URLs for your vault items, that's a lot of information that they can now use for whatever purpose they want. And with Bitwarden, we don't do anything with that. We don't sell your data. It goes in there. It's just for you. We don't even see the URLs. So depending on what password manager you choose, you want to make sure that that information is going to stay within your organization.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I wanted to build for years and years and years, and I wish I had, is simply my own corner of the internet. If I had every website, like full content of every website I ever visited, I think that would be rather useful to me, right? So from the perspective of that a lot of the quote unquote searching that you're doing, you're actually looking for information that you probably looked up before, right? There's a large percentage of that information that you were looking at before and you just didn't bother saving it. So if you just stored this locally, and now with storage being so cheap, I think it would introduce a lot of efficiencies just from an energy perspective, because now you're starting the search on your own hard drive or something like that. But then also would increase privacy, right? So because rather than you going over and over to a certain URL and then maybe alerting advertisers, best case, or otherwise nefarious state actors that want to penalize you for being interested in a certain topic that they disagree with, that would then be circumvented, because there was a site that I accessed 2 years ago and I might go back there and at some point in time might actually start contributing to that particular site myself. But it's not in the same way that we're doing it today, right? So the articles that I published over the years on LinkedIn, I will update those if and when I get better insights. but they're on LinkedIn, right? So if LinkedIn tomorrow decides they don't like me anymore, because I represent the radical view that we are first and foremost free human beings that should be in control over all your digital dust, then I'm SOL, right? So if I haven't saved all that content locally. Anyway, so but the point there being is you guys also have some note-taking option there, right? Do you see that A being used a lot, and then B, do you see you guys extending this to something like I was just describing?
Yeah, that's an interesting conversation. Yeah, any note item can store 10,000 characters of secure text. So there's a lot of opportunity there for storage and preserving and archiving. And sometimes it's definitely used because we'll see lots of users talking about it when they're importing data into their accounts. And it can be quite useful for certain things. And we do also have the option to self-host, just from our discussion about where these things are stored. So that's kind of helpful because if someone doesn't trust in the cloud, we can always they can always just get the server going themselves. But we do have a feature request right now for adding like rich text or markdown to the notes field, which then you'd open up a whole world of possibilities too. So there's lots of conversation, ongoing research and review on some of these items as we go. And relating to sort of one thing I like to is decentralized social media. So with this Twitter conversation, it's interesting because we've had our Mastodon account sometime earlier in the year, and it's really fun because companies can't like commercialize it as much as you could on Twitter. It's just this experience where nobody owns it, and you can jump on there and chat with people and have fun without that sense of capitalism on there. So we love that too.
Yeah. Hey, I want to go back to the identity conversation for just a second. In terms of sort of feature requests, I think one thing that Bitwarden might want to take away from this conversation is that instead of just thinking of yourselves as a password management company, and I'm not sure you do, but that's sort of the way I think of you, is if you think of yourselves a little bit more in the identity space, when you use Bitwarden to log yourself into a password, into a website, you might also think about it in terms of identity, that you might want to also have the opportunity to log people out of a website. That would be an interesting functionality. And if you take that a little bit step further, right, if you organized websites potentially in terms of identities, right? So I could take a group of websites and say, this is the Jeff identity, and this is the privacy plan identity, and this is the Your Bytes, Your Rights identity. Have that group of websites, right? And let me say, log me into all these websites and log me out of all these websites. That would be pretty damn cool. That would be something I'd buy.
That would be pretty wild, yeah. And it's a funny point you make about more than just a password manager. And the team always chats about how there's a reason we called it Bitwarden rather than password warden or something. So we're hoping to, exploring that landscape as new technologies and resources appear.
Yeah. Anyway, just a thought. Talking about identities, that really resonates with me. I'll have to think about that a little more. So another conversation I wanted to get into is a little bit more about entropy of passwords. We talked a little bit about some of the problems people have with passwords, but let's talk about solutions. You have a really great password generator. I love it, and that's actually one of the reasons I moved to Bitwarden. But I actually like the passphrase generator part of your password generator a lot. And I'm not sure if everybody really gets how the entropy of passphrases works. Do you have any thoughts on that or comments?
Yeah, I mean, sort of to what we talked about earlier, I think it's awesome to take the idea of a passphrase and have those couple special characters, whether you have your dashes in between or adding a special character to a specific word, so it's not just a typical dictionary word that would be easier for someone to break into. So yeah, it can be easy to add additional security to any passphrase by just adding a little bit of customization. But yeah, definitely making sure to meet a certain number of words, I'm trying to remember what the current one is, but I think at least 6 right now. I'm not sure what you use for your passwords, but yeah. And also, I'm always curious when someone uses passphrases. I want to know how many passphrases someone can remember, because I'm not sure.
Well, you know, if you use some memory tricks, you can actually remember them pretty easily. Um, but you know, I've been having this sort of debate with some people on passwords and passphrases, and their contention is that if they're just dictionary words, that a few dictionary words, 3, 4, 5, isn't enough entropy unless you throw in a bunch of other stuff as well. And I do throw in other stuff, so it's not necessarily a problem for me. But I'm not sure that it's necessarily all that low entropy to just use words, as long as those words are from different word spaces and are never used together. Like if you just randomly pick words like, I don't know, walrus, automobile, Mick Jagger, right? I mean, I don't think a password cracker is going to be able to crack that. I mean, it's long. Those words are never seen in the same paragraph, right? And even if it doesn't have special characters and numbers thrown in there, I can't see that the entropy for that isn't like astronomical.
Yeah, the randomization and chaos will help ensure that it's like the nonsensical aspect basically is going to help stop the machine from making relations from the words itself.
Right.
And I was going to say something really interesting that always comes up in our community when people talk about passphrases, because it's definitely a divisive debate. There's a lot of people for, a lot of people have questions. But one thing that users always make sure to note is when using passphrases, it's always good to have a master copy somewhere, just in case, because the human mind is infallible. So if something should happen to you medically, if aging causes something to happen with our mind, if we're purely relying on memory, it can be good to complement that with some kind of secure, analog backup.
Yeah, I mean, personally, what I see a lot still, and we're going to see for some time, is you have legacy systems that will tell you your password can be 8 to 12 characters or something to that extent, right? So they were limited, so I can't even hack in a secure passphrase even if I wanted to. And I think personally we need to go after these legacy institutions, which oftentimes is like your electricity provider or your bank or some other utility that still runs either a COBOL database in the background and that doesn't support even this particular simple interface, or
Yep.
or it's just the company's policy for no particular reason other than we decided this the day we launched our old website here that this is the way we want to do authentication. And yeah, but to the extent that we're using usernames and passwords today, I think ultimately we need to phase that out, right? So we get rid of this altogether, as in, or just using 2 or 3, no, probably at least 2 and ideally 3 things: something that I have, something that I am, biometrics, and something that I know in that particular conversation. But the unfortunate thing is usually that people only learn about these dangers of these legacy systems and their own behavior once they're compromised, right? And at that point in time, it's usually too late. So one of the things that Jeff and I want to do long term is basically have companies like yours and others put on monthly, weekly introductory courses, because one thing that I see, even with my own behaviors, I might install a software like that and then not use it or not configure it correctly. Right? And I'm technically inclined, so for me, I'll play with the advanced settings and otherwise see what I can do with that. But I think there's a large part of the population out there that's just intimidated simply by having more than one function. So to bring this to a conclusion, do you have good data on specifically how many people start downloading, installing it, and then actually consistently use that, or is this something that you guys don't pay attention to necessarily?
No, that's a great question. We definitely would see some of that from the app stores, depending on how they're set up, but I don't have that with me today. But Some of the initiatives that the team is working on is just that. It's improving our onboard ability to provide onboarding education to reduce those pain points, because we want people to be able to adopt these things that make the internet a safer place. And then also utilizing some of those in-app walkthroughs. So, similarly to how you get a Firefox update and it's going to show you those tips on what's new and here's where to start and where to go from there. So Bitwarden is in the space where we're looking at adding those types of things to reduce those hurdles. So it's smooth and it's easy and it doesn't feel like the technical tool that it is. So that's definitely the place where we're working to, where it's more seamless.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there are a couple places where I think I would probably improve Bitwarden, but I mean overall I love it. I use it multiple times a day. Use it probably for everything. But there are a couple features that I think I probably figured out, like months after I started using it, and I'm like, holy crap, it does that? That I wish I had figured out earlier.
No, totally. And part of my favorite thing is we're so receptive to feedback and looking at different ways to make things better. And when I do trainings, I always share the keyboard shortcut first, because it feels like such a hidden feature. When people realize they can just do the quick keyboard shortcut to get in there right away, it really changes the workflow that you use on a daily basis.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We had a couple other things. Do you have any questions from the audience? I don't think I saw anything in there. But I've got a couple other notes. Do we have anybody from the audience that has a question or wants to come on stage?
If so, just click the little button that says raise your hand at the bottom of Zoom. Otherwise, we'll let Jeff talk his questions.
Yeah. I had a couple other statistics that I thought were pretty interesting too. Oh yeah, one of the issues I wanted to ask you was about companies and organizations that force you to change your password. I really don't like that practice any longer. I mean, I think in the past it served its purpose. Now I think it just forces people into ingraining those bad habits of reusing passwords and creating variations of the same crappy passwords they're already using. Unless they're using Bitwarden, for instance, and letting it automatically generate new passwords, in which case it's great, right? But that's a very small percentage of the population. So I think, forcing you to change your password every month is a disservice to those companies that are forcing that, right? If you create a really strong password and remember it, why do you want to change it every month? That's a really terrible thing to propose, I think.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that is something that we see. And even in my personal experience at past jobs, you're basically taking the same thing and you're adding a 1, and you see people do this. And it's not adding any additional account security, and that is changing. And we always recommend to go with the standard guidelines, which is to not be changing your password unless you need to change it. Just keeping an eye on your vault health and using the 2FA. That's going to stop the attacks that way. But using a unique and secure credential per account rather than rotating it every so often, it just adds a lot of complexity, and it puts this chore into the employee's hands that complicates their workflow instead of just relying on a system to handle a lot of that information for them. That's definitely the way we're moving in. And even though we're moving away from some passwords, you'll hear Yubico saying that it'll take 10 years before we see lots of these changes because infrastructure takes time. And one of the results of the older infrastructure is that sort of 90-day or 60-day rotation. And so that's definitely being phased out, but definitely a pain point whenever we have someone that comes and they're like, we need to be able to do this still.
Yeah, and I think some companies and orgs have gotten wise and actually give you a little bit of, warning that you have to change your password. But the worst is when, you're trying to get something done and then all of a sudden now you've got to change your password and come up with a new one on the spot. I mean, that's the worst way to change your password, right? That's when you're going to get the worst password security because people are just going to throw some crap in there, whether it's adding a 1 or just making up something new and then forgetting it and having to call IT to get, get the password recovered because you can't remember it now.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, platforms logging you out while you're in the middle of something. Hey, we just logged you out for your convenience and security. It's like I was in the middle of typing a sentence into my Google Sheet. Why am I being logged out?
Google did that to me the other day.
It does it to me daily. I don't know why. It might be, and that's a related topic because I'm using one or more VPNs, sometimes laid on top of each other. And I've been experimenting with Opera for some time. I actually like it as a browser, but as of late, and I blame this on Proton, it keeps asking me if I'm a human. And I assume it's related to the VPN itself, unless my typing all of a sudden increased to a great extent that they think no one can type that fast. But I'm like barely at 13 a minute right now.
No, actually, well, if you're taking those typing classes, Chris, it could actually be changing your biometrics enough that they think it's not you.
That was like 10% of what I'm leaning towards. That's why I actually brought that up, because I was telling Jeff, after 40 years of typing, I finally decided to learn it.
That's really interesting.
Touch typing.
And it reminds me of the very first time that I was on the phone with my bank, and there was a message that said, your voice is being used to authenticate your identity. And I was like, wow, this is high-tech stuff. I'll never forget that day, the first time it happened. But it's really interesting, the different systems that we don't even think about, that they have all these patterns of our biometrics stored somewhere.
That cannot have been one of the major banks then.
Yeah.
Was that a local community bank?
No, this is a major bank.
Really?
But yeah, I'm not going to disclose for privacy, of course. But yeah, it was a big bank.
Yeah, I'm sort of concerned about that. I mean, I love two-factor authentication, and here's another stat. Microsoft claims that you're 99.9% less likely to get hacked if you have TFA on. And some of those two-factor authentications are biometrics, right? And they are very convenient. But a lot of companies that are implementing biometric authentication are not securing their data. So you need to be very careful about that. And this is including banks, because we've talked to a lot of facial authentication companies, and the facial authentication technology for authentication is very good, but it doesn't always come with APIs that mean that the companies that are implementing the solutions are actually storing your biometric information safely. So it's collecting the information for them to actually implement the storage separately and safely, and that's not always happening.
Yeah, and there's different ways to handle. Like some banks I've seen have questionable device-to-device authentication, where you're sending the request, you have your mobile device, and you'll see in Bitwarden we have like a fingerprint. It's going to show you on both devices, but with this one bank, it just says that was me, it wasn't me, and it's like, well, how do I confirm that someone's not just sort of spamming and trying to get access to my information? So even though there's all these technologies, they're not always done in the most beneficial way for the user.
Yeah, I mean, to me that's odd. I mean, to me it should be very similar, and for all of my stored data, to the extent that I get a pop-up on my phone, and that every time my personal data is being pulled from anybody for anything, it should provide me with the ability to reject that request. That even if it's a singular cookie from a singular website, and then obviously after some time I want to be able to train that and say, no, this is always me. And say, yeah, that's always okay, or it's okay for the next month. But these things are not being made easy today, right? So they are very complex, and even more, we were talking about the integration of facial biometrics. Jeff and I were just looking at the AWS API, and we have a wide network of experts on these nuanced topics. So we immediately sent this to our network, and within, I don't know, less than an hour, we had a response back saying, yeah, this is useless, basically, right? Amazon is marketing it to a wide variety of people, developers specifically, as a viable solution to conduct real identity checks, when we already know it's not, right? So there's no checks and balances in that space at all, and it just creates more surface structure for attacks. In the past, I keep mentioning this on the show a lot, but last year, just cybersecurity breaches amounted to damages of more than $6 trillion. And always as a frame of reference, that's larger than the GDP of all but 2 countries. And largely that has to do with the fact that you cannot simply not protect efficiently any data that you're committing to a database. Right? So as a company, you should never actually create a lot of data in the first place unless there's a very, very good reason to. And even if you're creating that, you have to create it in a particular manner. And so one of our objectives is, and Jeff has done an outstanding job creating databases and creating collections of data around these entities, is to literally invalidate that practice, right? And that's always a call to action that I want to put out there. It's like, if you work at a company that's still using databases today and there specifically is interacting with, let's call it customer or user data, start orienting yourself today towards a different paradigm, to a paradigm where you give complete control of this data to the actual owner, right? So because I ultimately, and hence the title of our show, consider all your bytes your personal property. If you created that, and maybe there's another entity that gets limited usage rights to that, which is a different topic, right? But by default, if this is something that concerns me, something that records an action that I did or whatever purchase that I made, then everything that has to do with that, by default, I consider my personal property, as in I have property rights, I need to have dominion over that. And if you cannot give it to me, and that's the other point, then you shouldn't collect it, right? You shouldn't get that option. And governments, quote unquote, and it's always individuals at governments, because governments are just structures of societies, functions of societies, are the worst at protecting information that they're storing, right? By and large, as kind of a rule of thumb. But then we just multiply this by allowing entities such as Google, Facebook, Amazon, the usual suspects, but then 4,000 more that you have never heard of, to multiply the dangers on a daily basis by just basically surveilling you the entire time and then making this data available to whoever wants to pay for that. Anyway, that was my today's rant, Jeff. I limited it to one. Don, usually on these things, and not only on these things, there's at least 4 or 5 of these rants, because this is all like a lot of pent-up energy after more than 14 years now that I've been working on these topics, and where I see, like from a technology perspective, from a topology perspective, from architectural perspective, the solutions right in front of us, and developers not applying them and regulators not asking for the application of that. Essentially, I want to see government entities put out laws and regulations that determine you don't get to store data in clear form at all, unless you can provide, again, property rights to this data to the actual owner of that, who can then intermittently provide you with usage rights to that on his terms, not the other way around. That part is absurd to me, by the way. It's like, it's my data and you give me your terms. No, I want you to give you my terms and conditions, because it's about me. It doesn't matter if it's my healthcare data, my financial data, my purchase behavior, or whatever it is. To me, that's the way it should be, right? It's my data, it's my terms. I don't care about your terms and conditions. They don't apply in my world.
Yeah, it makes sense. And if we don't move in that direction, we're just going to have to increasingly deal with identity cleanup and cybersecurity insurance and all those fun aspects, which are, I don't know if you've checked recently, but there's so many apps now about like identity, managing your identity, exposed identities. And it's like consumers don't even know which to choose from the plethora of mobile apps that are out there now.
Yeah.
And one thing I wanted to add from earlier, and I forgot to mention that if anyone doesn't want to use biometrics, you can also just use your keys. You know, you can have 2 YubiKeys, and you can have the Yubico even has biometric keys now. So if you don't want a stranger to come and pick it up, so it's like we have the option of totally removing the biometrics if somebody wants to take it to the next level.
Yep. I've got a YubiKey. I highly recommend it.
Well, we're at the top of the hour. For anybody listening, so we just opened up a line of communication for people to suggest show topics. For the time being, Jeff and I will only be able to do this show every other week. We're trying to do it weekly, but it's a lot of work, even though it doesn't seem to be. But Jeff and I do an actual production meeting for this every Tuesday, where we find people like Dawn and we discuss the topics in detail. And we dive down rabbit holes, come back out the other end. So we have a couple of other topics slated for the future if you're interested in those. I'm looking at the list and I'm trying to make sense of that, Jeff. Data rights.
Yeah, we want to do, for the 37th episode, we want to do healthware, talking about Fitbit and things like Google knows your heartbeat. Right?
Yeah, so if you have expertise and or access to someone who has expertise in that space, and I mean, I'm trying to develop kind of as a fun side thing, in a specific healthcare solution myself, just for my own use, not for wide distribution, but something where I can just record my own heart rate into my own Google Sheet intermittently and then create a proprietary solution. But I just don't like the idea that I'm accessing Apple's server. So if that's something that you're interested in, that's something that you have access to, reach out to Jeff or to me. And other than that, Jeff, lead us out.
Yeah, well, we want to thank Don Wilkinson, our tech evangelist from Bitwarden. Thanks for all the insight, Don. And until next week or next session, try to hold on to your bytes and your rights. We're looking out for you.